Welcome and thank you for joining today's call on special topics, high water and shoreline protection permitting. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Note that all attendee lines are muted at this time, but you can send any questions you may have to Jacob Myers in the chat box, as he will be screening those. And if for any reason you require technical assistance, please do not hesitate to send a chat to the event producer. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn the conference over to Jacob Myers, the project manager with the Detroit District of Army Corps of Engineers.
All right, thank you for joining our presentation on high water and shoreline protection permitting. This is brought to you by the U.S. Army Corps Regulatory Office in Detroit. Again, my name is Jacob Myers, and I will be the host for the event. So this means that I'll be collecting and providing your questions from the chat box to our presenters. We will take 2 questions after each presentation, and then after that, and we will, at the end, take more questions. So between each presentation, we have 2 questions. You can feel free to ask questions throughout the presentations, as I will be compiling them as we go. This presentation will be recorded and provided to you afterwards in case you miss anything or want to send a link to a colleague or a friend. All links found in the presentations will be provided in the chat box at the beginning of the presentation they incur in. So these are our presenters for today. We have Deanna App. She's a physical scientist with the Army Corps of Engineers. She works in the Hydraulics and Hydrology Office. We have Sarah Black, a biologist with the Army Corps of Engineers in the Regulatory Office in the Eastern Branch. And then we also have Audrey Kirk, a district supervisor with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy out of the Grand Rapids District Office. So with that, I will pass over the presentation to Deanna, who's going to be talking about high water levels. Just 1 second while I open back up our website. All right, Deanna, you should have presentation capabilities.
Yeah, hopefully everyone now is seeing my screen. Thanks, Jacob, for the introduction. So again, my name is Deanna Apps. I'm going to go over just some of the basin conditions and go over the main 6-month water level forecast that we put out through the Corps of Engineers. So to get started, I just want to go over some few notes about Great Lakes water levels. First off, we measure water levels as elevation above sea level in reference to the International Great Lakes Datum of 1985. This is measured as a height and not as a depth. As I go through this presentation, you'll hear me reference Michigan Huron as one lake because they're connected at the Straits of Mackinac. From a hydrologic perspective, they rise and fall together, so we consider them one lake. On our website, you can access daily lake-wide average water levels, and we compute those at the end of the month to monthly mean water levels. And really, that's the main water level that we report out at the Corps and we use in our 6-month forecast. We use a network of water level gauges to determine that daily lake-wide average water level. We do this so that we compute a water level really that's based on still water, and it balances out the impact from any meteorological forcings that could be occurring at a specific location. At the Detroit District, we have monthly mean water level statistics that go back to 1918 and through the current full year of 2019. We coordinate that data with Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as our 6-month forecast. And just to make this point known throughout the presentation is that primary drivers of water level fluctuations are changing weather patterns and the resulting fluctuations in water supply. So I just wanted to start off with another slide going over the Great Lakes Basin as a whole. It's a very large system As you can see from the graphic on the right here, everything highlighted in green is what we refer to as the Great Lakes Basin. So every drop of water that falls in this region impacts the water levels of the lakes in a given way. And then if you look at the diagram on the left, this is really a side profile view, which helps to indicate how water is flowing through the system. So, you know, water beginning in Lake Superior flows through the St. Mary's River into Lakes Michigan and Huron, to the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, to the Detroit River into Lake Erie, through the Niagara River over the Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario, and eventually out through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. I do want to take the time on this slide to notice 2 points in the system where outflows are regulated. And one is through the St. Mary's River in between Lake Superior and Lakes Michigan and Huron, and out of Lake Ontario through the St. Lawrence River. So regulation of these outflows is a responsibility of the International Lake Superior Board of Control and the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board of Control under the authority of the International Joint Commission. I want to stress that even though we can regulate outflows from these 2 points, it cannot prevent extreme high or low water levels, nor can it fully control water levels. Water levels are mainly driven by weather and Mother Nature that impacts the region. So next I'm going to talk about some of the factors that impact water levels. So what's highlighted in that circle there called net basin supply, these are the 3 main components that we're tracking that highlight the water supply to the lake. So that includes precipitation to the lake, runoff to the lake, and evaporation off of the lake surface. We also have to account for inflows from the upstream lake. For example, for Lake Michigan Huron, we have to account for that inflow from the St. Mary's River. And then we also have to account for the outflow out of that lake. So for example, Lake Michigan Huron, we would then have to account for outflow through the St. Clair River. So on an annual basis, water levels go through seasonal cycles, and a lot of that has to do with the hydrologic cycle. So in the winter months, typically when snow is accumulating and the ground is frozen, that's typically when we would see a seasonal low in water levels. As we enter the spring, we start to get warmer temperatures in the region, snow melts, we increase the runoff to the lake, and we also have likely increased rainfall, which allows the lake levels to rise through the spring and typically into the earlier midsummer. Once we get to the midsummer, typically that's when we see water levels reach their peak. And during this time, the increased sunshine will help warm the lake water. And that's very important as we head into the fall. As we head into the fall and early winter months, the colder air starts to enter the Great Lakes region. And when you have that colder air moving over the relatively warm lake surface water, that's what induces evaporation. And that increased evaporation during this time is one of the primary drivers of water level decline during the fall and early winter months. So this is our full period of record of water level data. This is, again, monthly mean water levels. You can see there's a graphic here for each of the lakes. So you have Lake Superior at the top, Lake Michigan Huron, Lake St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. That blue line is the monthly mean water level. The red line is the long-term average annual level. What you can notice by looking at this graphic is you can denote periods of high and low water throughout the full period, back to 1918. We can identify, for example, looking at Lake Michigan Huron, we can identify a high water period of the early 50s, a low water period here in the early to mid 60s, that high water period of the mid to late 80s that many people remember. But then we can also see that we entered a period of low water starting in the late 90s. And that period of low water lasted until about the mid-2010s. You can see Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron set record lows during this time. But then after that, the 2 to 3 years after that, we had a record rise in water levels And since then, on an annual basis, we've continued to see water levels rise. You know, they still go through that seasonal cycle, but over time, water levels have progressively gotten higher, and which has led us to some of the record highs of 2019 and 2020. So the next question becomes, well, why are water levels so high? And as I mentioned previously, that really we've seen a persistent wet pattern in the region that has allowed us to transition from that low water period to that high water period. And so what this graphic is showing you is this is Great Lakes Basin annual precipitation. So precipitation between the months of January and December. And this is data from NOAA, so it's only accounting for data on the U.S. side of the basin. And this line that you see going across, this is that gray line. This is the average between 1901 and 2000, so about a 100-year average. And you can see that over the last 6 to 7 years, precipitation has been above average in the basin. But then what I've highlighted here is the last 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19, have been exceptionally wet in the Great Lakes Basin. And that's what's really propelled these water levels to near record highs or above record highs in these last couple years. So now I'm going to walk through the 6-month forecast. We do these forecasts at the beginning of every month. So this is the current June forecast that we did at the beginning of June. Our beginning of July forecast will come out next week. I've included the link here at the bottom of the page where you can access that forecast if you're curious of how things change when we do it next week. But I'm going to spend some time, I have a graphic here for each of the lakes, starting with Lake Superior, but I'm going to spend some time on the Lake Superior graphic to go over how to read these graphics. So these graphics show water levels really from over the span of about 2 years. So across the top, you can see that the period starts here in June 2018 through 2020. You have a meters axis here on the right, your feet axis is here on the left. You read these charts based off of a reference level, and that reference level we refer to as chart datum. Okay, so chart datum for Lake Superior is 601.1 feet or 183.2 meters. Each line that extends from that zero line or the reference point is a representation of about 2 inches. So you'll see that the first line here, plus 2 inches, plus 4, plus 6, plus 8, all the way up to plus 12, where you get to plus 1 foot. So that's how you would estimate a water level on this graphic. This blue line, dashed line, is the long-term average monthly mean water levels. And then this red line is what the monthly mean levels that have actually been observed. And so you can see the monthly mean levels that have been observed from June 2018 all the way to May 2020. And then from there, our forecast extends for the next 6 months through November 2020. This green line is what we consider the most probable forecast. These red lines that provide that band represent a 90% probability range of potential water levels that could occur over the next 6 months. So if we experience wetter than normal conditions, we would be toward the upper part of this band. If we experience drier than normal conditions, we would be toward the lower part of this band. And then you can see that there are dashed lines at the top and bottom for each month. That represents the record high and low monthly level in the year that it occurred. So what I've highlighted here on the graphic in this orange rectangle is the record highs that occurred on Lake Superior last year. Lake Superior set records between May and September of 2019. I've also highlighted the records that have been set so far this year, and those are represented by those purple arrows. So in January and February of 2020, Lake Superior broke records. You can see the last 3 months we've been below record highs, and as the forecast extends to the next 6 months, we do forecast that water levels will stay about 3 to 7 inches below those record highs if you follow that most probable green dashed line. As you can see, Lake Superior is still in its period of seasonal rise. Its peak monthly mean level is forecast for August, and then water levels will likely decline as we head into the fall. So moving on to Lake Michigan Huron here, I'm not going to describe how to read the graphic again, but I'll just highlight the high points here. So you can see that Lake Michigan Huron has set records so far of the first 5 months of 2020. A lot of these records have to do with the fact that Lake Michigan Huron did not experience much of a seasonal decline this past year. It declined about half of what it typically does during an average year. And because of that, we started the year much higher than last year. And we have been setting records, like I said, every month so far this year. According to our forecast, you can see that right now we are still in the period of seasonal rise, forecasting Lake Michigan Huron to reach its peak monthly mean level in July. You can see that we are forecasting above record highs for at least through about September. September, the forecast is to match that record high from 1986. As you can see, as we get into October and November, we are forecasting those the water levels to be below those records from October and November of 1986. Moving on to Lake St. Clair. Again, this was another lake that set records last year between May and September of 2019. It has also continued to set records this year in January and in the last 3 months of March, April, and May. It's getting close to reaching its peak. The forecasted peak monthly mean level is for June. So it is likely that we will start to see this lake decline in the coming months. We are forecasting this June monthly mean level to be a record, but then after that, it looks like we'll be slightly below those records from last year through September, and then below those record highs in October and November that occurred in 1986. Lake Erie, a very similar story here to Lake St. Clair. Again, those records May through September of 2019, again has set records February through May of 2020, so another lake that had several months of record high water levels this year. Forecasting a peak, again, that peak monthly mean level in June. Probably we'll start to see this lake level decline here in the coming months and stay slightly below those records from last year through September and falling about 9 inches below those records of October and November. Lastly, Lake Ontario also set records here in June and July of 2019. Hasn't really set records here so far in 2020. And the forecast indicates that water levels will stay below record levels here, but will still stay above average, so above that blue dashed line. So water levels there are still fairly high, but it is forecasted that it reached its peak level already and will begin its seasonal decline here for that June monthly mean and for the rest of this 6-month forecast period. So just want to end with some key points here that water level fluctuations are primarily driven by weather and hydrologic conditions. Water levels in 2020 have continued to be near above record high levels on all lakes except Lake Ontario. Regulation of outflows, like I mentioned earlier, through the St. Mary's River and the St. Lawrence River cannot prevent extreme high or low water levels nor fully control water levels, and the impacts of high water are expected to be felt throughout 2020. And I'll just leave this with this last slide. This is our Great Lakes High Water webpage that has plenty of resources and useful contact information. This is my contact information here below, Deanna Apps, my phone number and email, and also my supervisor, John Alice, his phone number and email as well. So I will end there and take those about, 2 questions and then move on to the next.
Thank you, Deanna, for that interesting presentation on water levels. So I have one question right now. Before I ask that question, I just want to remind everyone, you can send me questions, Jacob Myers, in the chat box. It should be on the bottom right. So the question we got, Deanna, was how much is soil saturation affecting the Great Lakes water levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is having an impact because we've seen these persistent wet conditions over the last few years. The soil is very saturated, and that's it plays a major part with runoff. With the soil being very saturated, more water is running off to the lakes, and so it definitely has an impact when we get those large precipitation events. We've seen a few so far this May and June, and it does impact that runoff to the lakes.
Thank you. We just got another question in. Why does Lake Michigan have different peak time than Lake St. Clair?
Yeah, so the peak and lows tend to vary from lake to lake, depending on the hydrologic conditions that are impacting that area. So, for example, like Lake Superior tends to be a little delayed as well than some of the lower lakes like Lake St. Clair in Ontario. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the timing of, like, for example, like in the winter, you know, snowpack remains in the Lake Superior Basin much longer than it does in Lake Erie, for example. And so that kind of delays when, you know, that rise will start occurring and when we reach the peak. So it's kind of just based off that timing of when certain hydrologic conditions are impacting those specific lake basins.
All right, thank you. So those are the two questions we'll take for Deanna right now. Feel free, as you have more questions on high water levels, feel free to send those. We'll have another question period at the end where I'll also be providing questions to all of our presenters. So our next presenter up is Sarah Black.
Good evening. Thank you, Jake. As Jake said, my name is Sarah Black, and I am going to be speaking about shoreline protection projects in the state of Michigan. For shoreline protection projects in Michigan, structures and work in navigable waters of the United States, as well as discharge of dredge or fill materials in wetlands adjacent to navigable waters of the U.S. or in the navigable water itself, require permits. Navigable waters refer to not only the Great Lakes and connecting channels, but also some of its large tributaries. If you're unsure if you live or have property on a navigable water, please see the link below. Most shoreline protection projects on the Great Lakes, connecting channels, tributaries do require permits from the Corps of Engineers. We evaluate applications from the moment that we receive a complete application. In general, most of our general, also known as minor permits, are reviewed within 60 days. Most more complex projects that generally get permitted through our individual permit program get permitted within about 4 months. 60 days can seem like a long time when you are thinking about putting shoreline protection on your property. We highly suggest trying to streamline the process by tailoring your project to meet the conditions of a general, those minor projects. For us, these general permits come down to nationwide permits or regional general permits. For all of their conditions, please see these links. I'm going to go into a couple of our most common general permits. One of them is seawalls, especially seawall replacements. To qualify for this permit, replacement seawalls have to be within 1 foot of the existing seawall. They have lake-specific maximums, waterward, for a new seawall. And we tend to limit new seawalls or replacement seawalls to less than 200 feet unless you receive a permit from EGLE first. For a larger explanation of more terms and conditions, please see the link below. Riprap is also one of our other common shoreline protection projects applications that we see. And to qualify for a regional permit, we limit it to 300 feet and no more than 5 feet waterward of the ordinary high water mark, no placement in wetlands, and a maximum slope of 1 to 1.5. If it is steeper than 1 to 1.5, such as a 1 to 2, or it is EGLE conditions the permit that it must be a more gentle rise run than 1 and 1.5, they have to issue first. Perhaps our most common permit that we issue is Nationwide 13 for bank stabilization. The key criteria to qualify for this permit is using only the minimum amount of material needed for erosion protection. It is no more than 500 feet long and no more than 1 cubic yard of fill placed below the ordinary high water mark per linear foot of shoreline. No fill in wetlands. The criteria that are asterisked can be waived by the Corps. However, we have to coordinate with other federal agencies and state agencies, such as the EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and EGLE, which can take 10 to 25 days. This is an example of a project that would be permitted by Nationwide 13. This would be riprap along with toe stone at the toe of a bluff. This project is less than 500 feet long and has a gentle slope and is not placed in wetlands. Also commonly permitted underneath Nationwide 13 are sandbags. Sandbags that are placed waterward at the toe of the slope or on the waterward side of existing riprap typically require a Corps permit. Earlier I referenced that you can only use the minimum amount of fill necessary to qualify for a Nationwide 13 permit. This is what I mean. On the left-hand side, there's a significant amount of backfill, what is illustrated in brown, and then riprap is placed. This would not qualify for minimizing impacts. On the right, where the words are written in green, there is only a small amount of backfill to create an appropriate slope for riprap. We would consider this minimizing impacts, and this would qualify for a nationwide permit, which would be reviewed in less than 60 days. EGLE and the Corps only require one application to go through both permitting processes. At the link below, you can go to MyWater's joint permit application platform. From there, your application is sent to both EGLE and the Corps, and both EGLE and the Corps will render two separate permit decisions. Please remember, when you submit to MyWater's, if you make changes in MyWater's, the Corps does not necessarily know that changes have been made. So you considered having a complete application. These are the basic components: a detailed project description with dimensions and volumes specified, plan view drawing, a cross-section drawing, a location map that accurately shows the location of your property, and additional information as requested by the project manager. We also ask for construction sequence, which can include types of equipment, if access routes have to be built, dredging methods such as hydraulic or mechanical, sequence of work, and any kind of temporary construction measures. Here are some of the kinds of construction measures that are most common. On the left, in this construction, they are side casting dredge material. Side casting dredge material does require a permit and needs to be explained in your description of work. On the right, for these bridge repairs, a temporary access road had to be built with gravel that goes into the river. It also includes a silt curtain. All of these would have to be described in your drawings as well as the permit description. We also require cross-sections. A cross-section is a side view that is taken from one part of your project. Depending on the type of project, we may require multiple cross-sections. In your cross-section, you should be indicating how much fill or what kind of structures are waterward at the ordinary high. The ordinary high watermark is both a vertical and horizontal plane. In this illustration, you would need to indicate if there's any temporary stockpiling, if there is any dredge area to key in toe stone, and any fill that is waterward of the ordinary high, both vertical and waterward. Please note that the water elevation is not necessarily where the ordinary high water mark is. So drawings should show the volume of fill below the plane of the ordinary high water mark and the volume of fill waterward of the toe of the bluff. This would be considered a fully described cross-section. You can use a table to explain exactly how much of fill you need and in what dimensions. It describes the dredging, the amount of backfill, and the fill that goes onto the bluff as well as waterward of the ordinary high. Here's a paragraph that would accurately describe a proposal. Mechanically dredge 15 cubic yards of sand from the toe of the bluff in an area 100 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep to prepare to key in toe stone, side casting the material in uplands. Discharge approximately 37 cubic yards of riprap into the dredged area and landward onto the existing slope in an area 100 feet long, 5 feet wide, and up to 2 feet deep. Project drawings need to have a plan view and a cross-section. Relevant information should be clear and legible. It's not necessary that you have engineering scale drawings. They can be hand-drawn. We prefer scale drawings, and labeling all dimensions are a must. Here's an example of a drawing that not only shows the proposed work with all dimensions, but also shows existing conditions like the existing seawall on the neighbor's yard, the width of the property, and distance of the proposed work from a fixed structure, such as a house or a shed. It has the name and the addresses of the neighboring property owners as well as the applicant, and has a north arrow and a scale bar. As I showed in the cross-sections before, it is a side view that shows existing and proposed conditions. If possible, it can show the EGLE and core ordinary high water mark and the toe of the bluff. And we prefer if you can show water depth, either as a specific elevation or a specific datum, or the water level on the day you specify. What I mean by this is where it is circled on this illustration, this person didn't know the specific datum and so simply measured the lake water level on this date and showed the depth. They also show the existing structures along with their proposal, which in here is a new steel sheet pile bulkhead 1 foot waterward of their existing bulkhead, along with the dredge they plan to do to put in the materials behind the new seawall. If you are unable to measure the water depth at your location, you can always use NOAA's gauges that are around the state in all of the lakes, and below is a link to get to it. What we mean by showing existing conditions and proposed conditions on the same cross-section is illustrated here. They show not only what the existing slope is, but how the slope will change with their proposal. We strongly encourage that you provide photos. Photos show existing conditions and also indicate what kind of permit you may qualify for. On the left, which is not a wetland, a regional minor permit would definitely qualify, but on the right, where a wetland is present, a regional permit would not qualify. We also strongly encourage photos of existing conditions because it may eliminate the need for site visits, which would speed up your process. A few more tips on applying. Apply early, not at the last minute. If either EGLE or the Corps requests information, provide that to both agencies. We confirm receipt of applications via email. If you have not received that email, please go to our website where we list the pending actions and who is assigned to them with their contact number. For more information, we have a toolbox that is on our website, and our website also contains helpful information as wetland determination and a navigable waters list. At your local Corps office, they can arrange jurisdictional determinations for you and also meet you on site for pre-application meetings free of charge. We are always happy to assist with any questions about permitting, and we have a map included with our field officers, or you can call us at our district office in Detroit at this phone number or email the link below. Thank you. Over to you, Jake.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so we've got several questions coming in. I'm going to hold off on one of them because it relates to both regulatory agencies, the state and the federal agency. So for the first question I was going to ask is, are ecological effects considered when permitting a project upstream of a sensitive environmental area, either naturally occurring or artificial, such as an engineered reef? Did you want to take that one, Sarah?
Sure, and the short answer is yes. Depending on the depth of the project, an environmental assessment is conducted that looks at impacts of a particular project.
Okay, thank you. And then we had a couple about ordinary high watermark. I'm going to ask this one, could you please describe how to know what ordinary high watermark is? Given we are in record highs for water levels, is that the current water level for ordinary high?
The ordinary high watermark is specific characteristics on a bank that can correspond to an elevation and often does. Markings on a bank would indicate where a vegetation line ends on the Great Lakes, possibly the toe of a bluff. For more information, you can go to our website, or if Jeff Fritzma is on the line, he can probably speak more about that.
Yeah, you did fine, Sarah, with that answer. The biggest conditions are on Lake Michigan. It is toe of the bluff, so it will be a little higher than the water level currently is, but we will entertain applications at that time, or at that point.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jeff, for the follow-up on that one. So I've got a few more questions for us that we'll take at the end. Sarah, if you could pass it off to our last presenter, Audrey.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, as Jacob said in the beginning, my name is Audrey Kirk, and I am the district supervisor in the Grand Rapids office for the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. If that name doesn't sound familiar to you, we had a name change just over a year ago, and we were formerly known as the Department of Environmental Quality, so DEQ. DEQ and EGLE, same department. Also with me on the line is John Baya. He works out of our Kalamazoo office. He will be helping out with questions at the end. So my presentation is it's more broad and high level. I'm just informed that there is a gray box on the display, so I will try to get rid of that. Okay, hopefully that's a little better. And so EGLE's role is specific to permitting shoreline protection structures and assisting coastal communities. So it's no secret, sorry, getting a gray box.
Audrey, do you think you could switch from presenting the application to presenting screen? The event producer thinks that might solve the issue.
Okay, let's try that.
It looks good to me now. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the two photos that are shown in this, I mean, everyone I'm sure knows that this is the dramatic change that we've seen. The photo on the left, upper left, is in 2012 when we had record lows, and the next photo is actually 2019. So same house, same shoreline, completely different scenarios and problems. So everyone wants to know, when are EGLE permits required for projects in the Great Lakes? And the short answer is, unfortunately, more often than not, it's required, and it depends on what applicable state statute is applicable to that piece of property. So we have 3 statutes that are only applicable to Great Lakes. 2 out of the 3 are dependent on mapped areas. And then Great Lake Bottomlands, Part 325, is, of course, everywhere. So the other 2 statutes, Shorelands Protection and Management, Part 323, also known as the high-risk erosion area, so that's probably the term you'll hear more often when talking to staff. And Part 353, Sand Dunes Protection and Management, or Critical Dunes area, those are both dependent on mapped areas. So to know if those are relevant to your project and your property, you would actually have to go to our website to look at the map. Also, it's worth noting that in some areas there are local regulations that may be applicable. So when you're thinking about an EGLE permit and the permit process for the Army Corps of Engineers, it's also a good idea to check with your local regulators just to see if there's an ordinance out there that you may need to comply with. So again, when are EGLE permits required? These 3 bullets are very, very general, but if a project is proposed a structure or regulated activity such as fill or dredging below the ordinary high water mark on the Great Lakes, then you will need an EGLE permit. Now, as mentioned in earlier presentations, the Army Corps of Engineers ordinary high water mark is different than EGLE. So EGLE is 580.5. So if you are waterward of that elevation, then you will need a permit from us. Now, if you are doing work possibly not in the water, you still may need a permit from us if you're within a critical dune area. And again, that is a mapped area. You would have to go to our website to see, or contact your local EGLE staff and they can direct you to the right spot. But it's really important to look, especially for contractors. I know we have a lot of contractors on the line. So each and every project you work on, it's really important to double check to see if you're in a critical dune area. And then if you're dealing with a structure such as a house, and it's also important to note that a structure has different definitions under the critical dune program and the high-risk erosion program. So high-risk erosion is only if you're dealing with moving a house, constructing a house, or a septic system. So we've had a couple cases where individuals have lost their septic systems down the bluff. So in that case, if you're a contractor and you're helping them with the shoreline protection, you may also, through the permit process, need to check the box for a high-risk erosion permit and authority under Part 323. So, how to begin the process? That's usually the next question everyone has. Most people are probably not going to do the work themselves. So it's really important to find a shoreline protection professional or contractor who can do the work, who can help design the project. I can't stress enough that it is very specific to your property as to what is most appropriate. So it's really important to get a professional or contractor if you're considering a fairly large project, such as rock revetments and seawalls, those types. So once you've got someone, and I would always recommend checking references, so once you have someone that you're willing to work with, then work through what type of shoreline solution is best for you. The presentation before mine went through a lot of solutions, the most common ones that we see. So work through what is appropriate, what's going to work, what do you want to see in the years to come when hopefully the water goes back down. So the next step is obviously applying. And it's important that once you apply, because we are trying to turn around these as quick as possible, it's really important to be ready to respond if there are questions from EGLE staff and Army Corps staff. Moving on, once you submit the application, the next question is going to be a status update. You're going to want to know where your permit is in the process. The good news is you can, if you get access to My Waters, and that's dependent on if you submit the application or if your contractor or consultant submits the application. If it's the latter, you can actually contact us and request access to your application through My Waters. We are more than happy to make that happen. So the good news is you can get a rough idea of what is taking place with your application by logging into My Waters. You'll see any documents that staff has marked as public, meaning they're done with them. And you'll also receive notification of any correction requests that we have, which is just basically us saying something is missing in the application, we need clarification, or this section wasn't filled out, or maybe we need additional money. So there could be a lot of reasons for correction requests. Most of the time they can be addressed fairly quickly. And unfortunately, the bad news is that speaking for EGLE only, our permitting staff are very much at capacity with applications. So unfortunately, we are having to prioritize what gets our attention first. And so this slide shows basically what's going on with our permit load. As you can see, all the blue bars are the amounts of Great Lakes shoreline permits that we issued each fiscal year. Our fiscal year runs from October to September. So for 2020, in the first quarter, we did 510 permits, and those are issued permits. In second quarter, we did 548. So just in half of our fiscal year, we greatly surpassed the amount of permits that we issued last year. And as you all know, last year was still a high water year. Last year was very, very busy for us. So this year is definitely off the chart. So we've done a couple things to try to help everyone through the process, help us expedite permits, help you through the process, and just to communicate to everyone what is going on. The photo on this slide actually shows the septic system that has already fallen down and was taken in Muskegon. So these are the types of projects that this one's shown. This is a high priority. This is the highest priority. When a house is on the edge, this is going to get work done immediately. So as far as expediting permits, we've kind of gone through two phases. This phase took place in October of last year, so October 2019, and we created a team, and we called it the Great Lakes Erosion Response Team. And so we sat down and said, okay, what do we need to do to get these things moving as fast as possible? So again, I mentioned it already, but we prioritized, we created a prioritization of what needs our attention first. And that is based on risks to homes, critical infrastructure, and human health and safety. So if somebody is applying and their house is 150 feet off the edge, we are absolutely going to expedite that permit because we're expediting all coastal shoreline projects. However, it's not going to get the 2-day turnaround that somebody who is on the edge is going to have. So it's important to be mindful of where you might fall in that prioritization. Something else we did in October was just move staff from their normal assignments to focus on Great Lakes. So I can only speak for the Grand Rapids District Office, but we have 4 staff trained in the 3 statutes that I mentioned above. And so we essentially pulled all of them off of their other responsibilities because they had other statutes that they covered for inland resources. And we put them on Great Lakes pretty much full-time. We also were able to give staff overtime. We also created an emergency permitting authority. So there are steps that staff can take to issue emergency permits. We streamlined the permitting process as much as we could. We created a minor project category. So this was also mentioned in the previous presentation where the Army Corps has general and nationwide permits. So if you can meet those, the process is a little bit simpler and shorter. The state of Michigan has the same thing, only we call them general permits also and minor projects. So the names are slightly different, but it's the same general idea. If you can design your project to meet a minor project category, then we don't need to public notice that application, which will save 20 days in the processing time. So it's a good thing. We've also modified our critical dune procedures. Around this time, we were finding that with situations where there was critical dune impacts, some of the critical dune aspects and parts of the law and our procedures were causing some delays, so we made some modifications to make those a little bit quicker. Phase 2 came, I think, a couple months ago, and this addressed some additional unforeseen challenges. One of the things that was very normal until high water was if somebody does work without a permit, it's automatic, it's spelled out in the statute, you would have to pay an after-the-fact fee. So that was causing a lot of issues, naturally. And so we got approval to give staff some discretion on when they would apply the after-the-fact fee. So we still expect that people wait for a permit. We we do understand that there's cases where that is not possible. And in cases like that, as long as the contractor or property owner is communicating with us, with staff, then we can waive these permits. If someone does work without a permit and we happen upon it by a complaint or being at a neighboring property, that would be a situation where we don't have the ability to waive the after the fact. So again, this was phase 2. This tweaked it to make things move a little bit smoother for folks. As required under the critical dune statute, we do have to obtain comments from the local unit of government. So we worked with some of those folks to give us blanket response. So they basically say, if somebody is proposing a rock revetment structure and it meets this criteria, then we approve. So that's been very, very helpful in avoiding delays. We also changed what a complete application means. We still need these items to issue a permit, but before we would keep it on hold until we had them, because we have to have a complete application to move forward. So we've loosened that a little bit so we can accept these after determining something is complete. So we don't necessarily need these to determine that an application is complete, meaning we can move on without these. But it is very, very important that the contractor or the property owner is still working on getting us this information because it is still required by law. And then we've also clarified our emergency conditional permitting, and that just gets back to those situations that are the highest priority because critical infrastructure is on the edge, and it could just be one storm that makes it go over. Next slide is just on what we've done to really assist customers. Customers meaning everyone, contractors, consultants, property owners. We have a new website. It is michigan.gov/highwater. That has the most up-to-date information about what we're doing and what kind of guidance we have. So we have a frequently asked questions document on that. We have some assistance documents. One thing I think that is very, very helpful for folks is the contractor list. The contractor list, it's important to know that these are not people that have been approved by the department or in any way, it's not, we can't recommend anyone. However, we want, because one of the questions we got a lot was, who can I go to help? So this list is there. Anyone who wants to be on it, if you're a contractor and you want to be on the list, you get to be on the list. You just need to request it. So if you're looking for someone to help you through the process, this is a good starting point. We also have a phone line that has always been in existence, but now if you call it and you say you're concerned about high water on the Great Lakes, you will immediately be transferred to one of our staff. It won't necessarily be somebody who is doing the Great Lakes permitting because we're trying to keep their phone calls as minimal as possible so they can just focus on issuing permits. However, it is a Water Resources Division staff who is familiar with the permitting process. So they can get you started on how to submit an application in My Waters. They can answer general questions. And they can certainly direct you to the right person if you need to talk to a specific person on the coast about a specific project. The next slide is just about communication. We've been trying to do a lot. It's tricky to get the information out there. I mean, we're a government agency. We only have a couple folks that work in communication and public outreach, but we have done a lot on the high water. So these are different things that you can look for. we do have a lot of recorded webinars. EGLE staff have gone to a lot of meetings and sat on conference panels. So you can always look for additional resources and information from those sources. Okay, I'm getting down to the last couple slides, but I really wanted to mention one of the newer documents on our website, and that is the Great Lakes High Water Permitting Options and Expectations for Contractors and Applicants. I think the title sounds maybe a little harsh. Expectations is kind of a strong word. However, think of it as a roadmap. This is a document that will tell you what you need to do to stay in compliance with the law. So it breaks it up into different situations. The first that I've listed is just in all situations. Contractors and applicants are responsible for coordinating with EGLE, getting the proper permits before conducting the work. Again, there are some exceptions, and those exceptions are spelled out in the same document. Submitting accurate and complete information, being timely and thorough in response. I already mentioned this, but EGLE staff are trying to jump on these as quickly as possible and process them. So it's really, really helpful that if they ask for information, we get a quick response. That is very helpful. And then, importantly, avoid and minimize negative impacts to the shoreline. So those are the things that we expect of everyone. In addition, on this document, it also goes through expedited permitting, conditional permitting, which would be situations where we're issuing an emergency permit, maybe even before our review is complete, and also regulatory discretion. This is another thing that we've worked on and developed. It is very, very rare for us to give regulatory discretion, but we have done it in a couple cases where we were pretty sure that a house was going to go over if something wasn't done today. So we have a lot of tools, but I can't stress enough that property owners and contractors should reach out to us, make contact to make sure they're headed in the right direction. Okay. So I think I will get 2 questions now, and then we will be opening it up for more questions.
Thank you, Audrey, for that presentation. Yes, I do have a couple questions ready for you. So the first one is, does EGLE use physical shoreline characteristics on the Great Lakes for ordinary high water mark determinations, or do they stick with the ordinary high water mark elevation?
Primarily, we will stick with well, actually, I won't even say primarily. It is the elevation. That is actually what is spelled out in this statute, is our ordinary high is 580.5. If you're familiar with our Inland Lakes and Streams Protection Statute, that is different. So Great Lakes is a set elevation. Inland is more based on characteristics of the property.
Yeah, Audrey, I would just add something. This is John Baja. It's the datum for that elevation you gave is EGLE 85, which is sometimes missed and people get a little confused. And then, of course, if we're talking about other Great Lakes besides Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, it is a different elevation as well, like if we're talking about Lake Superior or whatever else.
Thank you very much. That is absolutely true.
Okay, thank you for that, John and Audrey. The other question I wanted to ask before we go into the next portion of this presentation is anything being done to exempt EGLE staff from mandatory government layoffs so the department is fully staffed?
This is a really good question, and I'm glad you asked because I forgot to mention it. Unfortunately, no. Right now, all EGLE staff are laid off 1 day a week. So essentially, everyone has a 20% reduction for time that we're allowed to work. That is taking a really big toll on everyone. Because of the state budget, we not only lost our, and let me back up a little bit. In October, we became authorized to have overtime. For those that work on the Great Lakes program, they could earn overtime when working on Great Lakes projects. So that ended the same week that we were told that we would be laid off 1 day a week. So we've been laid off 1 day a week since May 18th, and that will go through July 25th. So it's a 10-week period, and right now we're being told to expect an additional 10 weeks with 1 day off. So it is taking a big toll. So we're absolutely doing our best, but again, that's when the prioritization schedule comes into play for us. Is we just have to prioritize and try to move as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Audrey. All right, now, everyone, we're going to be sending out a few poll questions. We're going to open up the poll for 2 minutes. Those questions are just so that you can kind of let us know how this presentation went. We can kind of use it for future presentations. And while that poll is going, it'll be open for another minute and a half or so. Feel free to continue sending questions. I do have several questions I haven't yet asked the presenters, which I will present to them. And I'm also going to put up the contact information that each presenter provided. Will, can you let me know when that poll is closed? And then I'll start asking more questions.
Certainly, we have about 20 seconds left. All right, the poll's been closed.
Okay, thank you for that. So for anyone having trouble, you should have at the bottom of your screen several icons, and one should say chat. It'll be a little bubble. You can use that. If you click on that, it should open a window on the right side of your screen, and you can chat. Please chat to me, Jacob Myers, and I'll get any additional questions, and we'll take this time period now just to kind of respond to those questions. I'm going to start off with a question that was received for our Hydraulics and Hydrology Office. So, Deanna, if you could be ready. The question is, in the various Great Lakes subbasin water balances, how does the outflow from evaporation compare to the outflow through the respective rivers?
That's a great question. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Obviously, the outflows have been very high, given that we're at high water. Evaporation really varies throughout the year, which kind of makes it hard to compare with outflow that, typically is, throughout the year, these past, years of it being high water, it's just really been high. You know, we typically see the largest evaporation rates typically in the fall, early winter. Typically, this time of year, evaporation doesn't play as big of as big a component in the total water supply. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have you know, specific numbers to give, but it does. There definitely is an impact, obviously, from both. So.
Thank you for that, Deanna. All right, next I'll move on to a question that's for the Army Corps Regulatory Office. The question is, how does Corps determine how far landward of the ordinary high water mark they will take jurisdiction of seawalls and or riprap bluff protection? Sarah, did you want to take that question?
Sure. So, I'm sorry, Jake, how far landward of the ordinary high that will take jurisdiction?
Yep, that's
Is
correct.
that the question?
Yep.
I think the best way to describe it is if the existing structure or the seawall could change navigation, ebb and flow of a navigable water, will take jurisdiction. I know that's not a specific number of feet, but that is in general how we decide that. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think the easiest way to look at it is toe of the bluff, because that could have the exact parameters and the exact impacts that you're discussing. So pretty much toe of the bluff and the structure built from that point.
All right, thank you, Jeff and Sarah. All right, I have one question that's for both EGLE and also Army Corps. I wanted to ask that one because I wasn't sure where to direct people. So what is a good resource for finding the ordinary high watermark levels? So that's for both regulatory agencies.
Do you want me to take it for EGLE, Audrey?
Sure.
Okay, so the ordinary high water mark from EGLE's standpoint, what we have to work with is a set elevation on each of the Great Lakes. So that's pretty self-explanatory. If you want to know where it is in relationship to your property, one thing that you can do that will give you a decent approximation would be just to check what the current water levels are and then compare that, do the math with the regulated elevation. Basically all the Great Lakes right now are above our ordinary high water mark that's in the statute. That, of course, would only work if the lake is somewhat calm. If it's storming, that's really not going to help you a lot. You could always get a surveyor to identify it, or if you had a known elevation nearby, you could work off of that. But basically, if you're not doing any work in the water, then you're probably not below that elevation, since all the Great Lakes are above it right now. If you're looking at an inland area, that gets into Part 301 stuff for EGLE, and that's different. That can vary year to year. It's not a set elevation. Typically, occasionally on inland lakes it could be, but usually not. Usually that's done off of vegetation indicators, erosion, and that sort of thing. I guess
Thank you for that, Don.
Yeah.
Yep. Sarah, did you want to address that question, or do you want me to pass it to Jeff?
You can go ahead and pass it to Jeff.
Yeah, it's going to be about the same as Bea said, where it is. You're going to have to base that off the water level, and you're going to have to look at the at a calm day. And if it's storming out, you don't want to be out there anyways. And subtract from that point. If it's on an inland lake, if it's on a Great Lake, then we're back to toe of the bluff for the jurisdictional area.
Okay, thank you for that, Jeff. One other interpretation of that question, which I'm not sure if we have this, but the resources on the actual elevation marks that we use. EGLE, do you have a resource specific for like each of the lakes what the ordinary high water mark would be?
I believe it's on our website. It should be. This is John again. I'll only deal with Lake Michigan just because that's my jurisdiction, so it's one number that I need to remember. I can't think off the top of my head what it is for Lake Superior, but it should be available on our website. If not, you can always reach out to the local EGLE staff. They'll tell you what it is.
Thank you for that. And then, Sarah, do we have on our website specifically the ordinary high water marks for the lakes?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So the links for both EGLE and Army Corps were provided in the chat box. We'll also be sending out this presentation at the end, so hopefully you'll be able to see those links that we provided in the presentations. Okay, moving on, we've got several questions that came in for the state staff. So the first one is, do you need a permit for a cleanup of a bank where items such as tires or debris will be removed? So Audrey, do you want to take that question?
Sure. It depends. And it depends mostly on whether or not you're in a critical dune area. If you're in a critical dune area, then any kind of change to the grade would require a permit. So if material was dumped years ago and it's half uncovered now up and down the shoreline and you want to pull it out like tires and that kind of thing, we definitely want to see that kind of work, but if you're in a critical dune area, then you would need a permit. If it is above the ordinary high water mark and not within critical dunes, then you would not need it.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add one thing to that, Audrey. Sorry, real quick. I've had a similar project, or at least similar to what I'm envisioning in my head. To that wasn't a critical dune, and we did require a permit for it. We did work with the applicant, even though it was on a steep slope, and we were able to permit without a special exception as a restoration because the existing conditions were not very good, and the proposed conditions were significantly better. So did need a permit, but it was a relatively simple permit to issue.
Thank you for that, John and Audrey. Here's another question. This one I did put under the EGLE category, but I think that both agencies can respond to that. So we'll start with Audrey if you'd like to respond to this question, and then move on to Sarah if she would like to answer it. The question is, what efforts are you making to avoid and minimize negative impacts to the shoreline?
Good question. That is something that we look at with every application. We certainly want to be able to issue permits to protect critical infrastructure, but we ultimately are a natural resource protection department and division. So it's a balancing game, but typically with most reviews, and I will back up a little to the application. The application will ask applicants to consider all feasible and prudent alternatives. So we do expect that folks will fill that out. But if during the review process, staff look and say, you know, there's another alternative here, this might be a better option, they are going to ask the applicant specifically why they didn't go that route. So this could mean, I'm trying to think of a good example. We've had people propose seawalls and then go to rock revetment. We would consider rock revetment, if it can meet the minor project category, we would consider that less impactful than a brand new seawall. So, I mean, but we are willing to issue both. But again, we're always kind of looking to see if there are feasible and prudent alternatives that are less impactful.
Thank you for that. And then Sarah, would you like to add anything from the Army Corps perspective?
Yes. So any project that qualifies for our general permits, such as the regional and nationwide permits that I touched on, they were evaluated and they get reevaluated every 5 years for the impacts they create on the Great Lakes and connecting channels. And they go out for comment. And after evaluating all comments from the state, federal agencies, and the general public, as well as using our own expertise, we decided that if projects fit these categories, they are no more than minor effects to the Great Lakes.
Thank you for that, Sarah. All right, we have another one, which I think this one potentially could be answered by anyone. But we'll start with Army Corps again, so we'll have Sarah respond if she would like. So what is the best method of shoreline protection? Can't armoring the shoreline harm the Great Lakes and neighboring properties? Sarah, would you like to take that one?
Sure. The best method is likely highly dependent on where you live. I will also say that the Corps does not evaluate your project for engineering feasibility or long-term protection. We evaluate its effects on the Great Lakes and federal interests. Jeff, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, you said it right, very well said that we can't design your project for you. You as the applicant have to decide what is the best project for what you can, what you're willing to put your money into. And so it's a personal decision. I would say to talk to and do your research and make your decision based off of that.
Thank you, Jeff and Sarah. Audrey, would you like to add anything from the state side?
I think that was a really good answer. The best method definitely depends. And I would echo that we're looking at these for resource impacts and not necessarily engineering and will this hold up forever. If every time we're issuing a permit, we've determined that this is an acceptable impact to the resource.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Audrey. That was well said. Acceptable impact. So it's not to say that these projects have no impact. They obviously could have an impact. We're trying to balance that against protecting private property, right? Another thing I guess I would add is these are very expensive projects, as probably everyone on the call knows. So when you start looking at these, you know, which type of project do I want to do? Do I want a seawall riprap? Do I want to put sandbags in? You have to also consider the maintenance costs, in my opinion, which I'm not sure everyone always does. You could be looking at maintenance costs for decades, any time the water is high, essentially. So that's also something to consider. I've had several people recently decide to wait to install the riprap after they got a permit, just to see if the water goes back down, so they don't have to deal with it for decades to come. So it is something to consider, I guess, the long-term costs, not just the installation costs initially. Because once you have shore protection, you pretty much have to maintain it.
Thank you for that. All right, this one is specifically for the state agency. So what are EGLE concerns when designing repairs to riprap shoreline armoring along Great Lakes? If existing armor is greater than 50 years old or large concrete riprap?
I can take this one, Andre, if you want. So from a field staff perspective on how I would review this, initially I'd be looking at, do you need a permit? If this is in a critical DNR, you definitely do. If it's well above the water, you may not need a permit if it's not critical to. So we look at that first. We would probably be looking to minimize impact by, keeping as much rock out of the water as possible, but still maintain the structure and build something that's going to last. Obviously, we don't want you to put your money into repairing the revetment that's there and not have it last for decades to come. We'd probably also be looking at stability a little bit, not to say that we're designing it, but if you're proposing something that looks not like the norm as far as the slope of the riprap, we might question you on it, ask your engineer about it, that sort of thing. Other than that, I guess putting riprap over existing riprap, what's there underneath, and is it going to provide a stable foundation for it? But that's really for the engineer or the contractor to determine, not us. We just may question it if it looks very unstable. I had one recently where it was all large broken pieces of like sidewalk essentially and roadway probably, so concrete. And they wanted to propose a large boulder on top of that, which not to say it wouldn't work long term, but it can be somewhat unstable because it's not bedded in well, is my understanding. So we talked to the contractor, we worked something out, but anyway, I guess I'm done.
Thank you for that, John. So one more question came in. I'll pose this one to Sarah with Army Corps. Do you permit revetments to protect septic systems rather than require owners to move their septic systems landward?
Jacob, did you say that was a question for Sarah?
Yeah, I was going to pose that one to Sarah.
I admit I don't have much experience with septic systems that are not in wetlands. I assume we're talking about Great Lakes and eroding from the bluff. But in general, if a structure is already present, the Corps makes a priority to protect structures that are present.
Audrey, would you like to add anything from your side of the permitting?
Yeah, I did mention in the presentation that if a property is located within a high-risk erosion area, that moving septic would be something that would require a permit, even if it's well above ordinary high water mark, which we hope that a septic system is. So that would need a permit if it's high-risk erosion. And I think the preference for the state is always to move structures if you can. Not every property can, not every property has space to do that. But the sure best way to protect the infrastructure and the structures is to move it away from the edge. So if that is an option and a property owner is trying to decide whether they do shoreline protection to save their septic system or move it, and both are reasonable options and doable, I think the preference would be to, from a regulatory perspective, would be to move the septic system out of harm's way.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, Audrey. We've had a couple of those recently, and this is John again. A septic system varies a lot across the state on how much it's going to cost to install it, which essentially if you're installing a new one, you're not moving it, right? You're building a new one. But it's probably going to pale in comparison to the cost of even large riprap or seawalls or anything along those lines. Something that's going to last decades to protect the infrastructure is going to probably cost a lot more than rebuilding it. So it is a concern, especially if you're dealing with a septic system that's 20-some, 30 years old. It could be older than that. Is it really worth protecting versus just building a new one? Then you're set for decades to come, probably.
All right. Thank you to all of our presenters. We're running a little short on time. I'm wondering if the event coordinator can open our last question. We did miss a few questions. We're hoping to try and answer those, but the contact information is up on the screen, so feel free to reach out to the person that you think would be able to answer your question. And thank you all for attending this event. Let us know what more you want to hear from the Army Corps and what you'd like to hear about from our regulatory agency. Thank you, everyone.
All right, that will conclude our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.